A highly skilled, medically retired Marine Scout sniper named Bob Lee Swagger lives a quiet life in a remote house deep in the woods of Seattle, Washington, with his wife Julie and their young daughter Mary. Far removed from the violence and chaos that once defined his life, Bob Lee now spends most of his days surrounded by the calm of nature. Yet beneath the quiet surface of this peaceful life, the memories of war linger, and he remains haunted by the loss of his trusted spotter and best friend, Donnie Fenn, and often finds himself involuntarily replaying his comrade's last moments over and over in his mind. One day, while hunting in the woods, Bob Lee notices a wounded wolf trapped by two men and rushes over to help it. Seeing the pain in the poor animal's eyes, Bob Lee calmly uses a tranquilizer to sedate it before carefully freeing its leg from the metal trap. To ensure the wolf survives the injury, he administers an antibiotic injection to prevent infection. Angered by this, the hunters confront Bob Lee aggressively. Unfazed by their threats and weapons, Bob Lee firmly informs them that trap hunting is illegal in the state.
If you're gonna hunt, at least give the animal a chance.
We ain't giving out chances today, Al.
He scolds them for their cruelty and ignorance. When the situation escalates, Bob Lee reacts with the precision of a sniper, effortlessly disarming both men. Later, Bob Lee returns home, where he is warmly welcomed by his family. After putting his hunting gear in the shed, where his numerous firearms are stored, Bob Lee joins the family in the main house and prepares dinner. Later, the Swaggers sit around the dinner table, and after Mary says grace, the family starts enjoying their meal.
Good job, honey. I think that was your best grace yet.
You say that every night.
Chatting and teasing one another. The next morning, with Mary by his side, excitedly cheering him on and bombarding him with endless questions, Bob Lee spends a few hours repairing the deck until the unexpected arrival of his former commanding officer, Captain Isaac Johnson. Surprised by the visit, Bob Lee pauses his work, sends Mary inside, and prepares to speak to his old friend.
It's good to see you, Gunny.
You too, Captain Johnson.
Then, after Captain Isaac shares that he has joined the United States Secret Service and is in the President's protective detail, the men go to the shed to discuss the reason for the captain's visit.
I see you are still a bleeding hard liberal.
You never know when shit's gonna get weird.
Then, as Bob Lee processes the information presented to him, the captain shares that the infamous sniper T. Solotov is suspected of being behind the ordeal, which shocks Bob Lee to the core and asks him to help them prevent the looming crisis. Reluctant to return to the world, whose ghosts still keep him up at night, Bob Lee dismisses the request and rushes back to check on Mary.
Daddy, we gotta finish the porch before Mama gets home.
I'll be right there, honey.
Feeling desperate, the captain tries to pull on Bob Lee's patriotic heartstrings and asks him to reconsider his decision before leaving his card behind and speeding away. Elsewhere, that night, FBI agent Nadine Memphis prepares to arrest her informant Dmitry Voydan, who had promised her a time-sensitive intel, and goes to a local spa with her team. However, just as her team begins the operation, a Homeland Security unit, led by Officer Jack Payne and Captain Isaac, beats them inside and, despite Agent Nadine's protest, apprehends Dmitry.
Oh, come on, that's 6 months of work you're loading into that van.
Not wanting to let 6 months of her team's work go to waste, Agent Nadine follows the Homeland team outside and tries to persuade the captain to work together on the case, but fails, as Captain Isaac pulls rank, asserts his jurisdiction, and leaves. Meanwhile, at the house, Bob Lee tells his wife about the captain's visit, which had stirred up memories of Donnie, and confesses that he still blames himself for his comrade's death. He then narrates that on their last mission in Kandahar, he and Donnie had been sent to track Solotov. As they headed out, Bob Lee had dismissed his spotter's suggestion to take the shortest route to the desert and followed his own instincts, leading them in the opposite direction, where, despite taking every precaution and continuously monitoring their surroundings, they were ambushed by the skilled Solotov. Luckily, Solotov's first shot had missed its intended target and had struck Bob Lee in the leg, but within seconds he recalibrated and fired again, fatally shooting Donnie before either one had a time to react.
He died because I trusted my gut.
He died because Solotov shot him. That wasn't your fault.
In the present, after comforting her grieving husband, Julie suggests that he should consider taking the job, believing it might help him avenge his comrade's death and confront the elusive Solotov. Could avenging Donnie heal Bob Lee's conscience? I hope so. The next day, Bob Lee meets with the captain, who introduces him to Jack, and the trio discusses the routes and detailed itinerary of the president's upcoming tour of the Seattle Science and Robotics Center with the Ukrainian president Viktor Abramovich.
If he's hunting, He's gonna wait for his shot and it'll be perfect.
After a lengthy discussion, the captain details what he needs from Bob Lee. Later, the captain proudly boasts of Bob Lee's exceptional achievements to Jack. Elsewhere, Nadine receives shocking news about Dimitri from her superior, Howard.
Do something you don't normally do. Listen to me, and do not get involved in his Voidian mess. That's an order.
Despite being disappointed, Nadine tries to explain that Dimitri was trying to give her sensitive information, but it all falls on deaf ears, as Howard reprimands her. Then, after warning her to be more careful and focused, as punishment, Howard hands Nadine a stack of emails sent to the president, flagged as Charlie, the least threatening category, and orders her to vet each sender and report back. Disheartened, Nadine gets to work immediately and soon finds Bob Lee's name in the pile. Later, Nadine reflects back on what Dimitri had told her right before his arrest, finds what he left behind, and, as a show of good faith, reaches out to the captain.
Wasn't sure if it was tied to your investigation, especially with the upcoming presidential visit.
In the next few days, Bob Lee dedicates all of his time and energy to the new assignment, scoping out the tour routes, trying to think like Solotov, and running through countless scenarios in his head until he reaches a conclusion. Then, he meets with Jack and the captain, and after presenting all the possible shooting locations, Bob Lee gives them his professional assessment, and, out of the 3 potential sites, takes them to the location where he believes Solotov is most likely to take the shot from. At the end of the meeting, as Jack's team starts preparing, the captain tells Bob Lee that the president would like to personally thank him for his service and invites him to come to the tour.
It won't be necessary, Captain. I'm happy to help.
Trust me, you won't take no for an answer.
Elsewhere, Nadine shares her concerns about her findings in the Charlie list with her boss, who doesn't pay much attention and instead orders her to help secure the perimeter for the president's tour. On the tour, Bob Lee receives distressing news.
He's not here. No Solotov, no gun, no nothing.
He then advises Julie to leave the area and frantically responds while rushing to the location. There, Bob Lee is confused to find a rifle positioned for a shot and watches on the TV as chaos erupts at the tour site. Before Bob Lee can process any of this, an officer arrives, holds him at gunpoint, and orders him to surrender. Acting instinctively, Bob Lee jumps 3 stories down and momentarily escapes. Now in custody, Bob Lee is transported to the hospital in an ambulance, but all he can think about is his beloved family. Moments later, an agent announces that Bob Lee had missed, and instead of killing the U.S. president, had ended up killing President Victor. As the nation reels from the shocking incident, the captain is informed about recent updates.
Some guy named Bob Lee Swagger.
He lived?
Yeah, unbelievable, right?
Is the captain disappointed that Bob Lee survived? Elsewhere, Julie is taken into custody by FBI agents who threaten to charge her with obstruction of justice and interrogate her about the incident. Hoping to build a rapport with the distressed mother, Nadine arranges for Julie to talk to Mary, who is staying with her Aunt Anna and her husband Jim, which Julie appreciates. At the hospital, Bob Lee's lawyer, Sam, visits his client, who tells him that he has been set up, probably by the captain, and updates him on the list of evidence against him.
And of course, the murder weapon.
Later, Bob Lee is moved to a federal penitentiary, where Sam arranges for protective custody. There, once the door to his solitary cell closes and Bob Lee finally finds a moment to himself, he allows himself to feel the weight of his predicament, and his life flashes before his eyes as he confronts the betrayal he never saw coming from a man he served with and took bullets for. The more he retrospectively thinks over the matter and realizes how well planned everything had been, the more he's filled with questions he doesn't have answers for. How could his brother-in-arms disrupt his peaceful existence and throw him into such turmoil? To what end? How far does this go? What does this mean for his family? And how can the nation that he has spent his whole life defending rush to believe the worst of him? Failing to answer any of these questions, Bob Lee spends hours trying to silence the turmoil in his mind, to no avail. Elsewhere, Isaac discreetly meets with a CIA Black Ops operator named Hugh, who complains about the loose end in their otherwise successful mission.
You set him up, framed him for a murder, and tried to kill him.
Hugh then orders Isaac to find a way to silence Bob Lee soon. Following this order, Jack contacts a dirty prison guard through whom he sets a bounty on Bob Lee and gets him transferred out of protective custody into the general population. There, a few minutes after Bob Lee's arrival, looking to get paid, a prisoner attacks the newcomer, until a Russian mobster named Alex Prosovich intervenes and takes him under his protection. Then, Alex thanks Bob Lee for killing President Victor and soon moves him into his cell. Elsewhere, a frustrated Isaac confronts Jack.
Is that about how far you were from Bob Lee? I planned it down to the second. All you had to do was shoot him.
Meanwhile, Sam drives Julie to her sister Anna's house, where she's reunited with Mary and soon makes a shocking announcement.
They're saying Bob Lee wrote an email. Something about wanting the Medal of Honor like his father.
This doesn't sound like Bob Lee at all. At the FBI office, Howard once again reprimands Nadine. In prison, to the surprise of Bob Lee, Alex reveals a trunk full of contraband, including an untraceable phone, and allows him to make a call.
Hi, honey. Either we talk, or I will.
Then, Isaac visits Bob Lee in prison. Feeling cornered and desperate to protect his family, the sniper makes a shocking announcement.
There's only one thing I can do to protect them. I'll confess.
Elsewhere, in Anna's house, Nadine visits Julie, who challenges all of the evidence stacked up against her husband and forces the agent to rethink everything she knows about the case.
His number's actually much higher. Someone else wrote that email.
In prison, Bob Lee racks his brain trying to come up with a way to protect his family and shares his concerns with Alex.
Memorize this number, then wash it off. But I can guarantee that your family will be safe.
In Russia, Hugh meets with an FSB operator named Grigory Krukov to discuss their successful mission of killing President Victor and decides that Bob Lee must be eliminated soon. Later, Hugh calls Jack and orders him to have Bob Lee killed as soon as possible. Elsewhere, Nadine discusses the case with Isaac, who tries to find out the extent of her knowledge before advising her to keep a clear head and take the facts as they appear.
The Ukrainian president is dead. There has to be a connection.
Later that night, in prison, guards take Alex into solitary confinement, leaving Bob Lee alone in the cell. Then, after negotiating to split the bounty, the dirty guard unleashes a violent prisoner on Bob Lee, who uses his trained efficiency to defend himself well, kill both the prisoner and the guard, and escape from the prison. Furious by the turn of events, Isaac confronts Hugh and Jack for their reckless decision. After driving all night, an injured and exhausted Bob Lee arrives at Susan Fenn's house and politely asks her to let him stay with her for a few hours. Susan kindly accepts Bob Lee's request without any judgment. At Anna's house, while trying to figure out where Bob Lee could have gone, the FBI discovers Susan's location and rushes there.
You guys have been around me constantly. I haven't talked to my husband since it happened.
Elsewhere, as Bob Lee prepares to leave her residence, Susan gives him an envelope full of cash, advises him to go through Donnie's stuff in the garage, and to take what he needs, including his motorcycle. Utterly grateful, Bob Lee proceeds to do so, and while going through his best friend's stuff, finds an old picture of himself, Donnie, and Isaac, and becomes nostalgic. Then, he leaves the picture in plain sight so that Isaac will find it and be reminded of the friendship, camaraderie, and life he's destroying before packing up what he needs and fleeing. Later, Bob Lee calls his wife to see how his family's doing and apologizes for everything they're going through. A couple of days later, Bob Lee boldly calls Isaac and catches him off guard.
That's not gonna end well.
Not for you, it doesn't.
Later, a multi-agency special task force is formed to find Bob Lee, who has since disappeared, and Isaac makes a speech.
Bob Lee's true skill is killing, and he's mastered it.
Elsewhere, Isaac leads a similar meeting with his co-conspirators and forms a plan of action. At Anna's house, Julie comforts Mary, who misses her father, before driving to the store to get some ingredients for dinner. There, Julie receives a call from her husband, whom she misses dearly, and talks to him as she walks inside, with agents following her around and listening to her conversation.
Sorry.
Seriously?
I gotta go, honey. I gotta go.
Inside the bathroom, Julie is delighted to see Bob Lee and the couple embrace warmly. Then, Bob Lee informs his wife that Isaac is the one who set him up, and the duo discusses how to move forward.
Honey, they will kill you. They'll kill Mary.
Unfortunately, the agents soon find out Bob Lee's location, swarm the bathroom, but come up empty. Later, a frustrated Isaac and his team interrogate Julie about her husband's location, but failed to learn anything. Then, following her gut, Nadine approaches Julie.
Kyle Timmons. Do you know? Do you know him?
The hero cop who shot at your husband?
With the nation against him, Bob Lee spends the few days on high alert, cautiously blending in with his surroundings and moving around in disguises. Then, realizing that time is running out, Bob Lee takes a moment to figure out his next move and calls Casper.
Casper? Alexander Prosovich gave me this number.
At the FBI, Nadine shares what she learns with her boss, who, despite being convinced that Bob Lee is paranoid, gives her permission to follow the lead. That night, Isaac meets with Jack, who gives him distressing news and wonders when the exhausting saga will end. The next day, Bob Lee visits his old colleague Ron at a hospital and asks him for a favor. However, he's disappointed to see Ron's reluctance to believe his story, and as the guards start chasing him, proceeds to flee. Luckily, Ron soon changes his mind and comes through.
For the lives you saved, I figured someone owed you for that.
It's about time someone remembered Bob Lee's service to his country. That night, Jack visits Kyle at his house and interrogates him about his interaction with Nadine before killing him. Elsewhere, Nadine returns to her apartment and is shocked to her core to find Bob Lee waiting for her.
I'm not gonna hurt you. I need your help.
In the next few days, Bob Lee retreats to what he knows best, the woods, where his old friend's cabin is located, and with trained precision and accuracy, prepares to execute his grand plan. Meanwhile, at the FBI office in the task force, Nadine starts to watch Isaac closely.
Hey, I'll have my office try to locate that reporter's contact info.
After finishing his preparation, Bob Lee goes to a local store to get some water and is recognized by the owner. After locating the cabin, the task force surrounds it and cautiously approaches it. Once the agents enter the cabin, Bob Lee starts shooting at them from outside, which terrifies them. Then, Isaac steps up and carefully returns fire, which results in an unexpected explosion in the woods. In the aftermath, the agents inspect the explosion site and learn that Bob Lee, who had been wearing a suicide vest, had been blown to smithereens in the explosion and officially closed the intense manhunt.
Congratulations, we got him.
That night, elsewhere, Julie once again comforts her young daughter. And, just like Bob Lee had asked her to do, reminds her of the Musa Kala story.
What was the best part?
Daddy had to be a ghost.
In the woods, as the agents comb through every inch of the cabin, Nadine finds a treasure trove of information before receiving a mysterious call. A few years earlier, in Musa Kala, Afghanistan, while doing some recon, Bob Lee and Donnie are ambushed by a group of Taliban terrorists and are soon informed to abort the mission and escape. However, knowing that a convoy of Marines will be blindsided and ambushed if he followed order, Bob Lee ignores the direct order, improvises, stays behind with Donnie to kill each of the terrorists and protect his fellow soldiers. In the present, Julie gives a loving obituary at Bob Lee's funeral, attended by only a handful of people, including Susan. Meanwhile, outside the church, Isaac and Hugh meet, and Isaac is utterly horrified by his new orders to kill Susan. In Musa Kala, Isaac informs his troops that the commander of the Taliban, Mullah Abdul, has been located in a small village and details a plan of action to capture him.
Hey, lock it down. Swagger, before you say another word, you and Fenn will insert tonight under the cover of darkness.
He then introduces Hugh as a CIA liaison, providing intel on the complex operation, and has a private meeting with him.
I don't want him captured.
Despite his initial resistance to the shady request, Isaac reluctantly gets on board with the new plan and is forced to change the mission plan at the last minute, which raises a red flag with Bob Lee. In the present, Isaac spends hours trying to convince himself to carry out his latest orders, but fails miserably and wonders how everything got out of control and how far he's willing to go to protect himself. Inside Susan's residence, desperately hoping to find a way out of his predicament, Isaac advises the old woman to flee town and remain hidden for a while, but it all falls on deaf ears. Then, Isaac murders the kind woman in cold blood and buries her in her backyard. Meanwhile, Jack goes to the FBI office, introduces himself to Nadine as Agent Matt Sims of Homeland Security, informs her that Dimitri had recently been killed, and subtly tries to find out what she knows about Bob Lee's case.
That's where you fill in the blanks.
In Masakala, still confused by the new orders, Bob Lee and Donnie start their operation in the dead of night. Then, in the morning, the operation is in full swing. And as Hugh supervises from the control station, everyone takes their position. Then, as the Marines enter the village, they are shocked to their core to learn that Captain Rahim has double-crossed them. But before they can react to this, they are taken hostage and held at gunpoint.
We have no shot. Send a quick reaction force.
Then, just as Mullah and his men prepare to behead Isaac, Bob Lee steps in, takes them out one by one, and rescues his comrades. Why is Isaac trying to ruin the man who saved his life? In the aftermath, Hugh questions Isaac's leadership and scolds him for failing to control Bob Lee. In the present, utterly exhausted, Isaac drives home, wondering how he got to this point in his life, where he uses his training against innocent civilians he vowed to protect, and questions what happened to the honorable Marine he once was. At home, Isaac is welcomed by his wife, who greets him warmly and wonders if she will still be by his side if she knew what he was capable of. Later, Jack meets with Nadine and spins stories to assuage her curiosity, but she sees straight through his charade.
Congratulations.
Jack then resolves to plan B, drugs Nadine, and after staging her suicide, tries to kill her. Luckily, Bobley, who had been keeping a close eye, intervenes, rescues her, and a partnership is forged. With the world convinced of Bobley's death, Julie gets a chance to sneak out one night and meets her husband at a secret hideout, where they spend the night together. At dawn, as Bobley prepares to return to the shadows and live as a ghost, he shares his plans with his widow.
Baby, I'm so sorry about all this cloak and dagger stuff.
Then, not knowing when they would see each other again, the couple bid each other farewell and went their separate ways. Elsewhere, Nadine returns to her office and starts pulling all of Dimitri's files. Meanwhile, Bobley begins studying pictures taken at the time of the president's shooting, notices a squad car in the scene, disguises himself as a mechanic, and heads to the Seattle police station's vehicle maintenance arena. There, Bobley blends in, begins his search, and just like he had predicted, finds the unique bullet that killed the Ukrainian president. Then, just as the supervisor becomes suspicious and seeks him out, he flees. Once safely back in the shadows, Bobley arranges a discreet meeting with Nadine to discuss his findings.
I put it into a steel water tank. It's not even a scratch.
Then, using Nadine's ATF connections, the duo learns more about the source of the unique bullets, an ex-military militia group called Tree of Liberty. Meanwhile, following information on Dimitri's files, Nadine heads to a local establishment to speak to Dimitri's known associates, but is shocked to find a bloodbath inside, with all of the men brutally assassinated. Just as she processes this, Nadine notices Jack's calling card and realizes that the horrific scene is his handiwork. Then, Isaac learns of the massacre and, hoping to subtly find out how much Nadine knows about the matter, rushes to the FBI to speak to Howard, who alerts him to their new interest in the Tree of Liberty. Elsewhere, after a long journey, Bobley makes it to the militia's campsite and calmly approaches the men, led by an ex-Navy James Richards, and after sharing his anger at the government, informs them that he supports their cause. Knowing his sparkling reputation and his skills, the militia welcomes Bobley into their fold. Later, Bobley asks James about the unique bullets he found, but is disappointed to learn that they weren't one of theirs. Then, James and his 17-year-old brother Joey share more about their plans, but refuse to disclose their supplier.
You guys got a lot of followers?
We're going too soon.
Later, seeing how wrapped up the teenager is in his brother's mission, Bobley pulls Joey aside and tries to enlighten him that there's more to life than panning missions and guerrilla warfare. Then, Bobley sneaks around the campsite to learn more about the outfit's plans and is shocked to find vans full of explosives. Then, despite being in a time crunch and desperate to remain in the shadows, Bobley's loyalty to his country forces him to intervene. Hence, he calls ATF and leaves an anonymous tip. Meanwhile, the militia finds Isaac sneaking around their perimeter, discovers that he's a federal officer, ties him up, and presents him to James, who alerts Bobley to the discovery. Then, as James prepares to shoot Isaac on the spot, Bobley comes up with an intriguing idea.
And walk him down range and have some target practice.
Then, while Isaac remains tied to a tree, Bobley and James take their shooting positions a mile away and prepare to compare their shooting skills. Bobley goes first, shoots but misses on purpose, and saves Isaac's life, exposing himself to suspicion. That's twice now, Isaac. Your ledger is filling up. Soon, as the men continue their practice, ATF officers swarm the area and all hell breaks loose. In the chaos, Bob quickly reverts to acting on his country's behalf and neutralizes many of the militia, except James and Joey, whom he helps escape.
Head south, find the river, get on the Outer Banks and keep going till you get to...
Elsewhere, Jack comes to the FBI office but is soon arrested. Nadine interrogates Jack and, hoping to shake him up, lists all of his crimes. However, she's surprised to see Jack's psychopathic nature as she notices him revel in the attention he's getting.
I do like the attention.
Elsewhere, Isaac goes to meet with Hugh, but is confused to find him planning Bobley's fate with a group of men from a company called Anher Dynamics. Then, without explaining the situation, Hugh moves on, reveals Jack's capture by the FBI, and fearing being implicated by the unpredictable man, orders Isaac to find a way to silence him. At the FBI office, Nadine continues her interrogation of Jack and, after a risky attempt to rattle him up, gets a valuable clue.
He posed as a federal agent, and apprehended Dmitry Voidian, who had information directly linked to the assassination.
Howard steps in to calm Nadine down, but seeing Jack unraveling in the interrogation room encourages her to keep digging and get to the bottom of everything. Elsewhere, after recognizing Rathford O'Brien as his former instructor, Bob Lee finds his whereabouts and heads out to the outskirts of the city, where he stops by a diner to learn his exact location. Bob Lee then heads to the dense forest and walks for hours, cautiously avoiding numerous traps and constantly inspecting his surroundings and wondering what the highly skilled Rathford was hiding from in the deep wilderness. Later, despite Bob Lee's caution, Rathford sneaks up on him from behind and demands that he explain the reason for violating his privacy. Then, once Bob Lee identifies himself and shows him the unique bullet, Rathford calms down and takes Bob Lee to his shed, where he inspects the bullet and declares that it's not one of his products.
I hate to break it to you, Pork. That ain't my bullet.
Then, as the men continue chatting, Bob Lee shares his predicament in detail, and after hearing the incredible gunshot range at the time of Victor's assassination, Rathford proceeds to take Bob Lee to the wilderness and demonstrate the matter. Elsewhere, in town, Julie goes to withdraw some money, but is distressed to learn that her account is running low. Then, as if rehearsed, just as a disheartened Julie leaves the ATM, a man named Simon Porter approaches her and informs her that he wants to write a book about Bob Lee. Then, before Julie can even respond, the man offers to pay her a hefty sum for her cooperation. However, feeling uneasy about it all, Julie turns him down and drives away. On the other side of the city, Isaac heads to the FBI office, and while he waits to discuss Jack's situation with Howard, reviews the interrogation tapes.
Like you've never been assigned an agent who turned out to be bad news?
Before the meeting ends, Howard asks Isaac what he knows about Annex B. Frantic to get ahead of things, Isaac calls Hugh to find out what Annex B is, but doesn't find any answer. Hence, Isaac visits his childhood friend, Commander Justin Singer, who has access to the nation's confidential files, and, not caring what it would do to his friend's career, asks him for help. In the woods, Rathford takes Bob Lee to target practice, and after breaking his balls over his shooting skills, gives him some clues.
There are 4 rifles in the world that are strong enough to fire a bullet like this one.
Meanwhile, at the FBI office, ignoring Jack's annoying attempts to discourage her, Nadine continues pressing him, and after hours of back and forth, learns something useful.
Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but what the hell?
Elsewhere, after a thorough search, Isaac and Justin are utterly shocked to learn that Annex B is a program that the government uses to hire private militia to carry out black ops. However, as they proceed to dig deeper, their access is revoked, and they panic knowing someone is tracking their movements. Then, as Isaac remains frozen, trying to wrap his head around everything he learned so far, an image of the group of men from Anhor Dynamics flashes through his mind, and he realizes that Hugh is sending a private militia against Bob Lee. In the woods later, as Rathford and Bob Lee get to know each other better, Bob Lee finds the answer to the earlier question in his mind, as he realizes that Rathford is running away and hiding from all the decisions he has made in his life that cost him his family and forced him to seek companionship in his weapons. Then, Bob Lee suddenly realizes that he has a lot more in common with his former teacher than he thought, and becomes alarmed as he feels like he's staring at the lonely face of his future self. Soon, before Bob Lee can sort out his thoughts, Rathford receives an alert.
Multiple armored vehicles rolling in.
Roger that.
The duo immediately gets into combat mode, synchronously builds their plan of action, and lies in wait for their visitors. At the FBI office, hoping to get ahead of things, Hugh pays Howard and Nadine a visit.
What Agent Memphis meant to ask was, maybe you can tell us what the hell's going on.
Then, as Hugh dismisses Nadine, who asks him some questions, Howard comes to her defense and orders Hugh to show some respect to his agent. In the woods, a group of heavily armed private militia members swarms the area and tries to ambush Bob Lee and Rathford. However, the sniper duo expertly manages to take out numerous men until Rathford is injured. Seeing this from afar and noticing an assassin gaining on his former teacher, Bob Lee acts instinctively and shoots and kills the assassin from an incredible distance, which impresses Rathford. Later, as Bob Lee prepares to leave the woods, Rathford gives his former student his Black King rifle and some of his bullets.
You were the best shooter I ever taught.
Meanwhile, at the FBI, uniformed soldiers arrive and, after citing their orders from the Secretary of the Army, haul Jack away. Finally, Howard! Later, Isaac hears distressing news from Hugh and panics. Then, as he wraps his mind around everything, Isaac realizes that he's in over his head and questions how any of this will benefit the nation. With Howard now on board, Nadine is relieved to finally have someone to discuss the case with. Meanwhile, once back in the city, Bob Lee disguises himself, blends into his environment, and travels for days before stopping at a public library. There, he searches the web for any information on Black King rifles and finds the location of an upcoming gun show. Back in the city, Julie accidentally leaves her email open, and Jim stumbles upon the messages between the couple, which shocks him to his core. Elsewhere, Jack is escorted to his employer, CEO of On Her Dynamics, Lon Scott, who offers to compensate him for his contribution and relocate him. However, Jack has his own ideas.
Are you really this stupid? I'm not giving you $10 million.
Then, as Lon tries to process that Jack had the evidence all along, Jack smugly explains that he had taken the thumb drive off of Dimitri's body. However, instead of giving him the upper hand, Jack's demand backfires, as the revelation causes Lon to doubt his loyalty, and he soon washes his hands of him. Elsewhere, Hugh contacts Isaac, and after revealing that he knows Justin had helped Isaac access the sensitive files, orders him to kill him. Isaac tries to reason with Hugh and change his mind, to no avail. However, despite the standing order, Isaac promises himself that he will not hurt the man he had grown up with, and will figure out a way to protect him. On the other side of the city, Nadine storms into Casper's salon, and after some back and forth, convinces her to arrange a discreet meeting with Karlina Ordenko on Skype. Elsewhere, Bob Lee arrives at the gun show and expertly navigates through the crowd and subtly tries to find out as much as he can about Black King rifles from a participant, who shows him a video of a man shooting at targets from an incredible distance. There, as he watches the footage, Bob Lee remains frozen as he believes he's staring at the assassin who killed the Ukrainian president. Then, still unable to take his eyes off the screen, Bob Lee tries to learn more about him.
What's that guy's name?
Lon Scott.
Then, after leaving the show, Bob Lee informs Nadine what he learned and adds that he is heading to the headquarters of On Her Dynamics in Virginia to find out about Lon. Meanwhile, at the house, second-guessing everything, Jim reminds Julie of everything he and Anna have done for her, questions her about Bob Lee's death, and announces that he no longer wants to deal with the drama. On the road, as Bob Lee drives to Virginia, he's stopped by an old police officer for a broken taillight. Bob Lee stays calm for the first few minutes, but just as the officer tries to run his fake license, he knocks him out and flees. After driving a few miles, hoping to stay under the radar, Bob Lee takes a break to steal a different car and changes its appearance before continuing his journey. That night, Nadine speaks to the journalist on Skype and is shocked by what she learns.
I saw the smoke coming from the piles of burning bodies.
However, as Nadine tries to understand what Karlina is saying over the static, it all goes downhill from, and she is traumatized by what she witnesses. Elsewhere, Isaac learns what Bob Lee's up to and frantically calls Hugh.
What the hell are you talking about?
Lon Scott, it's him, right?
The next morning, Nadine meets with Howard discreetly and informs him of everything that transpired. Still shaken up by the turn of events and hoping to find some answers, Nadine visits Casper but is confused to find her frantically packing her stuff and preparing to flee. Nadine then tries to press Casper for information and learns that Grigori is behind everything. In Virginia, Hugh approaches Lon to update him about Bob Lee's plans to visit him and scolds him for exposing himself.
Your paternal instincts would be better focused on Jack Payne.
At the FBI office, Nadine investigates Grigori, who's listed as an official of the Russian Ministry of Trade, which has affiliations with On Her Dynamics. Curious, Nadine then goes through Jack's files, notices that he's been regularly receiving money from the same company, and tries to figure out what's going on. However, Nadine's work is interrupted moments later by Jim, who comes to the office to meet her, shares his suspicion of Bob Lee's death, and hands her the emails as evidence. In Virginia, Bob Lee heads to Anchor Dynamics headquarters, disguises himself well, and delivers a package to Lon. However, when he returns to his car, Bob Lee is caught off guard to see Isaac waiting for him.
I'm not here to kill you. I just want to talk, all right? Is that what you told Donnie's mom?
The audacity of Isaac Johnson. At the house, Julie is furious to learn about Jim's actions from Nadine and reacts violently. In Virginia, Isaac calls Justin, whom he has gotten a year-long assignment in Afghanistan in hopes of protecting him, and apologizes for everything. Elsewhere, after discussing the case with Bob Lee, who asks her to join him in Virginia, Nadine asks her boss for a suspension and heads out. Then, Bob Lee calls Lon, who is still reeling from the delivery, and officially declares war. A few days later, still confident, Jack calls Grigori, hoping for a big payday. Meanwhile, Nadine joins Bob Lee in Virginia and updates him on the latest development of the case.
He's got 3 guard rotations, 6 in each unit.
Then, after agreeing to do everything they can to expose the conspiracy and all its participants, the duo gets more information and heads out.
Lon Scott's on the move.
I know where he's going.
The duo follows Lon to the private airstrip and observes from afar as he meets with Hugh and Grigori. Then, hoping to learn more about the meeting, Bob Lee risks his safety to get closer and is surprised to hear the men discuss Jack's demands. Then, after learning that Jack has the valuable thumb drive, Bob Lee comes up with an idea to pit the conspirators against each other and starts designing a plan. Elsewhere, after learning that Isaac desperately wants to retire from the chaos and start a new life, Hugh orders him to find Jack and obtain the thumb drive, and in exchange, promises to fund his retirement. Meanwhile, Bob Lee and Nadine track Grigori to a local hotel, find out his room number, and ambush him there. However, before they can proceed with the plan, they are held at gunpoint by Grigori's men. Then, as the duo attempts to offer Grigori a deal, he orders Nadine to prove that she's no longer working for the FBI.
As you know, your access to FBI files is revoked.
Don't call here again.
Then, as Nadine breathes a sigh of relief, Bob Lee gives Grigori a tempting offer. Meanwhile, Isaac follows Jack, ambushes him inside his car, holds him at gunpoint, and tries to force him to give him the thumb drive. However, knowing that Isaac is bluffing and can't afford to kill him without finding what he wants first, Jack smugly challenges Isaac, who furiously leaves. Elsewhere, in the woods, Bob Lee takes Nadine on target practice and trains her. That night, the duo sets up for their mission, and after giving Nadine some orders, Bob Lee proceeds to sneak into Lon's mansion. There, Bob Lee expertly neutralizes the guard, makes it to Lon's office, and ambushes him. But instead of killing him, plays him a recording.
I could have taken you out 2 days ago at the hangar when your guards left you exposed.
Then, as the men continue their chat, Lon's personal obsession with Bob Lee and his achievements becomes apparent, and he tries to intimidate him by sharing how much he knows about him, before comparing their skills. Then, within hours, just like Bob Lee had predicted, the pieces start falling into place. In the house, just like she discussed with her husband, Julie prepares herself and Mary and waits for the perfect time to sneak out to the secret shed to meet Bob Lee. Then, when the coast is clear, she bids an emotional farewell to her supportive sister, who's worried sick about her, and after promising to contact her as soon as possible, leaves with her. Elsewhere, Bob Lee and Nadine set up for the operation at the airstrip and make a plan.
Like I told you, if all goes well, all you have to do is spot.
On the other side of the city, Grigori makes his own preparations. At the airstrip, just as the deal goes down and Bob Lee takes his position behind his rifle, he notices Isaac.
Swagger, what's wrong?
Johnson's down there on a long gun. He's got a beat on my location. I need to move.
Moments later, as soon as Jack is paid his diamonds, Nadine starts shooting at the men, causing chaos. As all hell breaks loose, the men soon figure out that Bob Lee is not behind the shots and flee the area. Then, Jack speeds to his friend's establishment to collect the evidence, and just as he heads inside, Bob Lee, who had been hiding in Jack's trunk, steps out. And as soon as Jack emerges with the flash drive, attacks him and flees with both the evidence and the bag of diamonds. Later, Grigori is informed about what happened, and frustrated with Hugh's incompetence, severs his ties to him. Elsewhere, at the secret shed, while Julie prepares for Bob Lee's arrival, she hears mysterious sounds, and feeling highly suspicious, orders Mary to hide under the bed and goes out to check it. However, moments later, she's subdued, and Mary screams at the top of her lungs when the men come after her. After finding out about the kidnapping, a frantic Bob Lee and Nadine have a heated argument about the best course of action to rescue Mary and Julie.
I want to find them too, but we have no chance without help.
Then, while Isaac, Jack, and Lon discuss their next move, Bob Lee calls Isaac and sets up a meeting with him, and Isaac rushes off to see the sniper. Moments later, a terrified Julie and Mary are handed over to Lon and Jack, who welcome them with hostility. Elsewhere, after spending his life orchestrating murders, Hugh finally meets his fate.
Goodbye, Mr. Mitchell.
In the woods, Nadine and Bob Lee ambush Isaac, and Bob Lee demands to know about his family's well-being. Isaac returns to Lon's estate to speak with Lon and Grigori, and after warning the men that Bob Lee is scoping them from the woods, he shares the sniper's demand to know his family's well-being before he can discuss the trade. Out of options, Lon and Grigori agree to the terms. Later, Isaac, Nadine, and Bob Lee meet, and Isaac scolds his new partners for choosing an FBI front company as their hideout. Then, Isaac gives Bob Lee a number to call so that he can talk to his family. Then, after Nadine calls the FBI and gets a trace on the number, Bob Lee calls his family, Bob Lee then talks to Julie and Mary and, hearing how scared they are, promises to end everything soon and rescue them. Then, as Bob Lee prepares to head to the traced location, Isaac challenges his plan and the two get into an argument.
One way or another, this ends in blood.
Elsewhere, Jack and Lon make a plan of their own. Meanwhile, Bob Lee orders Isaac to supply him with the weapons he needs and sets up a detailed mission plan to rescue his family. At the mansion, as Lon prepares his weapon and proceeds to leave to ambush Bob Lee, Grigori reminds him how desperately he needs to recover Annex B and convinces him to let his men come with him.
We did not start this as a way for you to prove you are as good as Swagger. This is about the map of the world.
Is this all about ego for Lon? At the location, with Nadine's help, Bob Lee and Isaac head inside the suspicious building in hopes of rescuing Mary and Julie. While unbeknownst to them, Lon scops them from afar. Inside, the duo encounters many armed men and takes them out one by one until they get a revelation.
Payne set us up. Julie and Mary were never here.
Then, Isaac and Bob Lee use their experience to outwit Lon and escape with their lives, while an outraged Lon returns home and argues with Grigori. Later, the trio reunites to discuss what happened, but Nadine and Isaac argue once again as Nadine suggests alerting the FBI. Fearing this would immediately get his family killed, Bob Lee comes up with a new idea and heads to Lon's mansion. There, as Bob Lee is escorted inside, he attacks a few guards and waits for Lon at his office. As soon as the CEO enters, Bob Lee holds him at gunpoint and, for the sake of his family, offers him a new deal.
I'll ask again, is my family alive?
Lon takes the deal and offers to release Mary and Julie in an hour at a public park. As Jack prepares to take the hostages to the park, he cuts a shady deal with Grigori. Meanwhile, as Bob Lee prepares to go to the park, he realizes that there's a good chance that he won't survive the ordeal, but takes comfort in the fact that his family will finally be safe. Then, preparing for the worst, he pulls Nadine aside and gives her the coveted thumb drive. As the meeting time nears, Nadine and Isaac set up on the roof of a tall building, hoping to spot Lon and give cover to Bob Lee, who stands in the middle of the park, hoping to see his family.
I have eyes on an SUV.
Do you see the driver?
No, I can't make out anyone inside.
Then, as the duo continues, Nadine sees a shady car around the park and, following her gut, leaves the park to follow it. Meanwhile, Lon sets up at an incredible distance from the park and prepares to show off his skill by accurately and fatally shooting Bob Lee. Soon, a van reaches Bob Lee, and Jack escorts a frantic Julie out. As soon as he sees his wife, Bob Lee is relieved, but soon realizes that Mary is nowhere to be found and demands answers.
Back up there, Bob, before it gets messy.
As negotiations continue, Lon starts firing at his target, but is confused by his own inaccuracy. Lon continues to shoot, and unbeknownst to him, soon reaches the sabotaged bullet that Bob Lee had placed in his rifle during his earlier visit to the office. Hence, when he takes the next shot, Lon, who had always wanted to go down in history as the best marksman in the world, dies by his own weapon. Lon will go down in history, all right, just not for that. Then, using this destruction, Isaac shoots and gravely injures Jack, setting Julie free.
Let me do it.
Then, Bob Lee tries to calm down his frantic wife and promises to find Mary soon. However, it all gets worse when Julie sees Isaac and attempts to attack him for what he's done to her family until Bob Lee assures her that he's on their side, at least for now. Then, Bob Lee gets a call from a panicked Nadine, who explains that Grigori had orchestrated Mary's abduction and has taken her to the Russian embassy. At the Russian embassy, Grigori imprisons Mary in a safe room in the basement, and hoping to calm down the terrified young girl, he calmly serves her some cookies and milk, which she refuses to eat. Meanwhile, following the shocking revelation, Nadine, Isaac, and the Swaggers rack their brains for hours and finally come up with a workable plan.
I want my daughter.
I'm sorry?
I know you had her taken. My daughter, she's at your embassy.
As hoped, the bewildered Russian ambassador rushes back to the embassy to find out what's going on, while calling Grigori and reprimanding him on his way. At the embassy, the National Security Advisor, Patricia Gregson, arrives after getting wind of the incident and warns Grigori to release his young hostage.
Good luck, Mr. Krukov. Call me if you need anything.
A few hours later, in the basement of the embassy, Mary gets hungry and eats some cookies while the ambassador warns Grigori. Moments later, the ambassador notices Bob Lee attempting to get past the embassy's security, helps him enter, and, after confessing that he had nothing to do with the ordeal, gives Bob Lee the keys to the basement so that he can rescue his daughter. Then, Utterly grateful, Bob Lee blends in, cautiously navigates through the corridors, and after neutralizing a few men, reaches the basement, where he finds his precious daughter. Bob Lee frees his daughter, sets fire in the kitchen, uses the chaos as a distraction, and flees. As he drives away, Bob Lee realizes that he can't continue living like this and putting his young daughter through this anymore, and despite his exhaustion and desperate wish to disappear with his family, decides that he must find a way to stop Grigory for good. However, moments later, Julie notices the hesitation on her husband's face, and her heart drops to her stomach as she realizes that for Bob Lee, the saga is still not over.
Diamonds?
If I'm not back by midnight, you keep heading south.
Bob Lee then gives Julie a gun, a room key at a nearby motel, and after advising her to be careful, he sets off to complete the mission. At the Russian embassy, Grigory defies orders to return to his country and instead shares his plan with the ambassador.
Представь, она уже американцев. Это конец.
Elsewhere, Bob Lee calls Isaac and gives him a message to pass on to Grigory. Then, in the woods, surrounded by the trees and the silence, Bob Lee is momentarily at peace and thinks about everything that has transpired and everything his family has gone through. Then, the sniper goes around the woods, choosing the best spots to set up his weapons and preparing to face the upcoming battle alone. Then, Bob Lee pushes aside the thoughts of failing his family and lies in wait for the Russians. Elsewhere, as Isaac rushes to sneak out to the park, he's arrested by the FBI, who decide to join the ordeal at the park and head there. In the woods, Bob Lee expertly kills each of the Russian soldiers one by one. Meanwhile, as the FBI arrives on the scene, Nadine frees Isaac and allows him to help in the operation. Elsewhere, Grigory follows the GPS, arrives at the motel, and after demanding Annex B, ambushes Julie and Mary, who whimper in fear and try to evade the storm of bullets. In the woods, Isaac is injured while defending Bob Lee, who manages to expertly kill all of the soldiers. Then, as an exhausted and defeated Isaac limps away, he profusely apologizes to Isaac for everything he put him through. Moments later, Bob Lee gives the $10 million worth of diamonds to Isaac and warns him to stay away from him. Did Isaac deserve such a gesture? Then, Bob Lee receives a call from a frantic Julie, who begs him for help. Hearing the shots in the background, Bob Lee acts swiftly, sets up his rifle, and, after making sure that the motel is in his scope, shoots and murders Grigory. That night, Bob Lee is arrested by the FBI and is joined by Sam and Nadine as he's taken to see Patricia.
You are exonerated for the assassination of the Ukrainian president.
In the aftermath, Nadine and Bob Lee take a moment to appreciate one another. Later, Bob Lee rushes to reunite with his family and returns to his home for the first time in months. Elsewhere, Isaac meets with Patricia, who tries to persuade him to work on another mission. Despite surviving the many wars he served in for his nation, Isaac is utterly exhausted and broken by the one he started on Bob Lee, which has robbed him of his principles and integrity. No longer trusting his ability to tell right from wrong, Isaac refuses the order and proceeds to limp out, but his past makes sure he doesn't get far, and he's confronted with the blaring sounds of gunshots.